Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third part of our Cry for Hope in Lent series. It's a pleasure to see so many of you back again as familiar faces, and also wonderful to see some new people here tonight. My name's Charlotte Marshall. I'm one of the advocacy officers at Sabeel-Kairos UK, and I'm going to sort of guide you through tonight as I am the other parts in this Cry for Hope series. Our talk tonight is going to be on the question of apartheid, and is Israel an apartheid regime? And I'm really delighted that we've got two wonderful speakers with a lot of experience and understanding about the question of apartheid, who I'll be introducing shortly. Just to say a few housekeeping rules to start with, you should have just heard that we're recording this event. We're just going to record the speakers, not the question and answer session. But if you do want to not be seen on a recording, I just ask you to turn your video off now. As you came into the call, you should have been muted. And can I please ask you to stay on mute unless you're asking a question during our question and answer session? It just helps us to reduce the noise down in the background.
That's me.
I can hear a few people now who aren't muted. So if you have a chance just to mute yourself, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much. Very quickly, we are running a question and answer session. We do this every time after we've heard our speakers. It would be really good, actually, if you could use the raise your hand function, which is provided in your Zoom bar under reactions. If you can do that, it just moves you to the top of my screen so that I can easily call on you. And if you are struggling, don't worry, just drop me a message in the chat and we'll make sure that we call on you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for the evening. The first of our speakers is Dr. Alan Mosak, who I'm very pleased could join us because he had a little bit of a dental emergency this afternoon. So we are hugely grateful for him to coming along anyway, despite that. Alan was very influential in the struggle against South African apartheid, and he's joining us tonight from his home in Cape Town. He became the leader of the United Democratic Front, which brought together a wide range of community and church organisations. He won the 1985 Robert Kennedy Human Rights Award, and he's written many theological works, including Farewell to Innocence and Kairos, Crisis and Global Apartheid, The Challenge to Prophetic Witness. He continues to speak and lecture on all sorts of global human rights issues pertaining to our Christian response and Christian faith, including that, of course, of Israel and Palestine. So thank you, Alan, for joining us, and it's a pleasure to have you tonight. Our second speaker is Rev Brian Brown, who is a familiar name and face to many of you on this call. Brian was born and brought up in South Africa, and after a conventional white upbringing, he began to question the apartheid system, so much so that he joined the Christian Institute, which was then banned from South Africa, forcing Brian with his family to leave and come to the UK. He began working as a Methodist minister in Methodism, and then shortly after became the Africa Secretary for the British Council of Churches. He's written two excellent books, which I can highly commend: his memoir, Born to be Free, and most recently his book, Apartheid South Africa, Apartheid Israel, which is a detailed analysis of the parallels between the two systems. So the format for the evening is that we get to hear 15 minutes from each of our speakers, followed by a 30-minute question and answer session. And then after that, if you are running your own Lent group and you want to continue your discussions either online or in person, we encourage you to leave at that point to give yourself time to do that. The rest of us, please stay online. We'll be summing up very shortly, just with a very brief recommended action for the week and also a prayer. So without further ado, I believe, Alan, you're going first. So if I can ask you to unmute, I'd recommend for the rest of us that we put speaker view on, and that will help you to be able to see Brian and Alan in your screen. And the next 30 minutes is over to you both. So Alan, are you with us? I'm just having a look.
Thank you, Charlotte. I am with you. If you can hear me.
Wonderful. We can hear you. Thank you very much, Alan.
Very much. Thanks a lot. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. And I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. My dental emergency came upon me, as all emergencies, totally suddenly. But God has blessed me with a wonderful and faithful Muslim dentist who, when I called him and told him what the issues were, and what I was going to miss tonight if I was not attended to. He left everything, sacrificed his Sunday afternoon, and I went to him, and he fixed it up. Now it's not a perfect and permanent solution, but it's okay to get us through tonight, and that's all I wanted from God, and that's what God has given me. So I'm very, very grateful and happy to be with you tonight. So, like all Black South Africans who had heard of what was happening in Palestine, even before we were able to go there, you will remember that the issue of Palestine were very high on the priority list of the South African liberation struggle for many, 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 many years. And those of you who might have seen that video when Nelson Mandela for the first time went to the United States at the end of 1990 or 91 or so, and he had that town meeting with Ted Koppel. Ted Koppel asked him about the Palestinian question, and Nelson Mandela said, look, the Palestinians and the South Africans were fighting the same struggle, and we are determined to stand by our friends, and we will not be told by you or by any other country in the world who our friends should be or where our solidarity should lie. And that has always been, from a political side, the issue for Black South Africans. However, from the church side, as almost in everything, we were very slow to understand and very slow to catch up. But when we began to have the privilege to go to Palestine, every Black South African that I know came back with this testimony. It is exactly like ours, apartheid situation. And some of them were totally shocked. Some of them were deeply, deeply, deeply disappointed. I don't know why. Maybe we expected from a people who had gone through what the Jews had gone through in Europe under Hitler, and who knew from firsthand experience what it meant to be racially discriminated and to what absolute atrocities that could lead, would understand that it would be absolutely impossible almost to turn around and then turn those same methods and attitudes and policies and practices on another people whose land you have occupied and stolen, and we're continuing to steal. So the shock for South Africans was great. I went there in 2016, and I came back with a feeling I share the conclusion of my compatriots. But you know what, Charlotte and friends, I was thinking about that since then, and all these years I've made a few points. Number one, yes, it is without question an apartheid state. Without question, the policies are apartheid policies. Without question, the practices are apartheid practices. Without question, the consequences of those policies are what we experienced under apartheid. But I came away with a clear conclusion that as bad as apartheid was for Black South Africans, we were not close to what Palestinians are experiencing under Israeli apartheid. We never knew such a thing as roads for Arabs only and roads for Jews only. We never knew such a thing as war, not just the intermittent violence that apartheid, I mean, like South African apartheid, Israeli apartheid is an inherent violent system. It doesn't matter at what level or what area of life, whether it's education or health or whatever it is that you're talking about, it is a violent system, and the violence is always inflicted upon those who have been subjected by the dominant group. So we understood that. But, and we, of course, I lived through the 1980s, through states of emergencies. I have seen what it means when the police and the army have carte blanche. They can do whatever they like, and there is impunity, and there's never an opportunity for accountability for them. So I know what that means. But even with all of that, South African Blacks have never known the constant state of war being waged upon us, not as a metaphor, but as a deadly reality every single day, like in snipers, like in guns, like in bombs. I mean, we knew the violence of the constant humiliations that I saw in Palestine, those long lines at the checkpoints, the way the soldiers, these young kids, speak to mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers. I spoke to women when I was there who had given birth at the checkpoints because those soldiers wouldn't let them through. I mean, all of those humiliations and situations we knew, but constant war, as in the war in 2014 upon the people of Gaza. Black South Africans never knew that. And the other thing that made apartheid in Israel worse than apartheid in South Africa is, even if it took a long time, beginning only in 1960 after the Sharpeville massacre, when the world began to wake up and really began to understand something terrible is happening in South Africa. The World Council of Churches who came, and with them brought people who took that understanding back to the Western world. Even with that, it took a long time for the international community to begin to understand. And I mean, we began after 1960 to understand how difficult it would be for us to break the bond of white solidarity across the international community. And I don't want to take us away, and I don't want to digress, but what we see with Ukraine now and the reaction that we saw all on social media of these journalists, one after the other, and expressions like, oh, this is so shocking, this is so terrible, this is so tragic. Why? Because they look like us, because they are Christians like us, because they are blonde and have blue eyes and are white like us, even because they watch Netflix like us. I mean, the absurdity of white solidarity, but yet the lethal reality we understood, but not in the way that has become clear to Palestinians, because even while Europeans and white Americans say these things and are rushing in unprecedented ways to show how much they are in solidarity with white Ukraine, they have for over 70 years never shown an inkling of that towards Palestinians. So the hypocrisy is not only glaring, the hypocrisy is deadly. And I will not go into what that says about the white Western world, but it shows you what Palestinians, and I'm always thinking, with everything that has been happening over the last 70 years, what must Palestinians feel now when they see this day after day after day? So that to me is clear. And so in that sense, Israeli apartheid towards Palestinians is much more deadly, much worse than Afrikaner apartheid and white apartheid in South Africa was towards us. But if you look deeper, we began to think about what is this apartheid. We understood that race is what they were building it on, but we also understood that race is a social and a political construct that is used for social and political control and for the benefit of the dominant white class. We understood that. Yet, we also understood as time went on very, very clearly that although this is a political social construct in theory, its realities are being played out on Black bodies every single day in a million ways. And so it is not proper for the church to engage itself in the theoretical discussions about race and racism and what that might mean and what not mean, and philosophize about it. Our concern was, what does it mean when a philosophy or a social or political construct or theory is played out in practice upon the bodies of Black people and the lives of those who suffer? And so that's how we began to think of apartheid and what its purposes were with us. We knew that apartheid had grown out of imperialism and colonialism, the same as in Israel towards the Palestinians, and that long process, in our case, over 350 years, in the Palestinian case now, more than 100 years after the Balfour Declaration made it absolutely clear in 1917, that it was a process that was intentional, and it made an intentional, undeserved, generated enrichment of whites that went hand in hand with a generational, intentional, and undeserved impoverishment of Black people. That's on the economic side. We understood that plus what I just said about the political, practical side of the social political theory means also that we have to look at apartheid in a different way. And so we saw apartheid had these major 4 pillars. One was the political power and the political control that it afforded whites, and that you should always couple with the solidarity that came from the white international community. B, there was the economic control and the economic exploitation for the benefit of whites. Always remember, one should add after every pillar, it's for the benefit of those who are the dominant class, who are in control. The benefit of white South Africans, the benefit of Israelis. 3, apartheid is a violent system, and you see violence in all its forms at every level, including psychological and physical violence, which we met every day with the police and the army. And 4th, the last major pillar of apartheid was religion. Its moral and theological justification, its biblical justification. And we also understood that as far as the white Afrikaners were concerned, that last pillar was for them the most important of them all, because otherwise they would just be a savage white tribe inflicting their violence and their greed upon Black people. But they were never that in their own view. They were always called by God. They were the Israel of Africa. They could justify their existence and their doings biblically. They developed this very sophisticated theological construct called the Theology of Apartheid, which they formed. And that to them, the salving of their consciences, so that what they were doing was always in obedience to God, carrying out the will of God. And that was the most important thing. Just in brackets, when in 1982, we took the decision that apartheid was a heresy at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, I met afterwards, years later, in Chicago with Martin Marty, that famous theologian of the Lutheran Church at the University of Chicago. Martin Marty said to me, you know, Alan, when you guys were over in Canada, I was in South Africa, and I was talking with John de Gruchy the day that the news came that the World Alliance had taken that decision. And this is what John de Gruchy said to me. He said to me, Martin, you must know that today the South African apartheid government has just fallen. Only they don't know it yet, because John de Gruchy understood the crucial nature of that theological power matrix that their religion gave them. I need to get to my close, and this is what I just want to say. So that is exactly what Christian Zionism in Europe and the United States is doing today. And we said, you can't be a Christian and support apartheid. You can't deny the created people of God, created in the image of God, and then claim to be a Christian. That createdness in the image of God was confirmed by the incarnation of Jesus Christ. For South Africa, this was an important argument when I mentioned John Calvin, because John Calvin says that God, when God looks at God's self as in a mirror, he says, sees human beings who are created in God's image. And he says God delights in seeing human beings who reflect the image of God. Now, when you are a Christian and you don't understand that, then it means that you have lost complete track of what the gospel is trying to say. We knew that white power and white racism declared Black existence as deviant. This is the same way that Israeli theology and politics and Zionism declares, and Christian Zionism declares Palestinians non-human people, not humane, not in the image of God. And once you do that, that leaves the door open for you to do everything that you can. It allows with impunity every single inhumanity you can inflict upon them, because you don't have to be accountable to them or to God, because they don't have anything to do with the image of God that you claim for yourself. And those are the things that give rise to the horrors and the atrocities that we see on a daily basis in Israel, much more so than we saw that in South Africa on a daily basis, except for those years in the 1980s. So I said in my paper to the World Alliance, the apartheid gospel was perhaps willing to admit that God created us all, but they added a but. It's a fatal but. So that but was, but you are created maybe, but you're not white. You are created maybe by God, but you're not Jewish. And so that religious and racial exclusivity and exclusion as the beginning of the heresy. And my view is that we have come to the point where the churches in Europe and the churches in Britain must be confronted with this particular issue. You cannot support Israel, its policies. You cannot be a Christian Zionist. You cannot support that reading from the Bible and still claim to be truthful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is heresy, it is blasphemy, it is sinful, and it has to be spoken out. It has to be told like that. My very last point. In the 1980s, I used to make a point of saying to politicians and Christians in the West, the apartheid question in South Africa, with all that it represents and all that is at stake for humankind in us, is the litmus test for our political morality and our theological integrity. Then I used to say, the same today is true for the question of Palestinians. The Palestinian issue, like the apartheid issue in the 1980s, today is the litmus test for political morality for all politicians and all politics. And it is the litmus test for all Christians and our Christian integrity vis-a-vis the gospel of Jesus Christ. And my view is that the time has come for us to be very clear, to be very unapologetic, and to be very unequivocal about that. Please forgive me for talking too long, but I had a fright today that I would not be able to speak to you. So my excitement is getting a hold of me and making sure that you hear everything that I say. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's a pleasure to hear from you. And it's so timely that you talk about particularly focusing on the idea of the church, and our time has come to confess of our sin of supporting oppression and supporting apartheid. And that's very much in the whole theme of this series. That's what the Cry for Hope call really says. And we'll be looking at that a bit more theologically next week. So wonderful sort of background to South Africa and apartheid and leading us into that. We'll definitely forgive you for going over by a few minutes. And please stay online, because I'm sure we're going to get some good questions for you at the end.
Oh, absolutely.
Over to Brian now. Brian, you need to unmute yourself, but we look forward to you. You've got the floor for the next 15 minutes, Brian.
Great to be with you, Alan. It was a few days ago that we engaged, and we asked one another what lessons were learned from those dire apartheid days, for we shared together in South Africa. And the lesson I learned from you, sir, though you were very young at the time, was that if you want to understand oppression, then it's best actually to speak to the oppressed. It's not as if the oppressor doesn't have a viewpoint, but the oppressor is a threatened being who doubtless desires to defend oppression. And you were a bit of a rarity in my life because, well, you weren't white. And all of my upbringing had contributed to my understanding of my society from a white perspective. And I was encouraged, not particularly in my home, but by society in its expectation of my life, that I would not bite the hand that fed me. And apartheid fed me very well, actually. I was a potential fat cat in a society which was totally committed to my well-being and my protection from the black hordes who would destroy me. And so I thank you for that. And if it seems as if the most pertinent point I can make in this particular moment is that in seeking to understand oppression, we listen to the oppressed. I say the basic and the obvious because it isn't obvious to those who seek to tease out truth about Israel-Palestine. The past week, I was in a theological college where I understood that part of a program would be brought by an organization called Solutions, Not Sides. And there is the understanding that if you are pursuant of truth, then remember there are always two sides. Remember there is the best of British balance to introduce. Remember that there are two narratives. Well, of course that's true. There are two narratives being played out as we gather in regard to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine at the moment. They might be intent on saving Ukrainians from genocide, or they might be invading a country with the most violent of intent and the violation in so many ways of international law and basic human justice. And I hope you've made your mind up. I hope you're not seeking for balance in this particular moment. And I had to, sitting at the feet of Allan, come to the realization that it was the oppressed who had to be listened to. And in the context of the Christian Institute for which I worked, of our intimate relationship with Black consciousness, I made discoveries. And the discovery was essentially the sheer evil of apartheid and the propaganda of a white state that was intent on telling me that apartheid was an expression of good neighborliness. But apartheid for me, through the likes of Black consciousness, was seen to be, in grand terms, a white elite with a political ideology that was racist and nationalistic, being an ethnic group who were seeking to dispossess the Black 80% population of their land, of their nationality, of their human rights, and of their freedoms. And that grand apartheid is replicated intensely, not totally, but very, very much in the Israeli dispossession and the Israeli domination and the Israeli violation of international law and the Israeli violation of Palestinian rights and the violence of it all, overt, covert. That system is, as Allan has suggested, that which his people, Black people, experienced in South Africa. I was unsurprised when Allan said, but that evaluation is subject to a proviso. Yes, apartheid was horrendously evil as my people suffered it. But in Israel-Palestine today, apartheid plus, as I call it, is practiced. And Allan endorsed the understanding that this fresh manifestation of apartheid in Israel-Palestine is worse than that which his people, dare I say, my people, suffered. And whereas that analysis, which has in the circumstances to be brief, was helpful for me in reevaluating the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I have been so heartened in recent days to see that one after the other, international human rights groups have come on board, or probably more truthfully, we in the church are seeking to catch up with this analysis. So B'Tselem and Yesh Din, Israeli, not Arab, but Israeli human rights bodies are saying, yes, in the context of domination and dispossession of violent intent and implementation, Israel is an apartheid society. And then you have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, distinguished bodies in the field of human rights, coming on board as well. So what was seen in the wilderness, a voice challenging what I call anti-Palestinianism, we find that we are not so much a wilderness voice anymore. And I have written that I took my young family to Dachau to view a concentration camp, a German Nazi endeavor to exterminate Jews and Judaism. And I did so because I wanted them to abhor anti-Semitism. And I hope they do. But these days, we have had to learn to abhor anti-Palestinianism. And Alan's second teaching, and this brings me to an end, Alan's second teaching to me was not only, if you want to know about oppression, listen to the oppressed primarily, but if you want to be a Christian, don't believe in apartheid. And that was a tough one. It was tough in demanding that a follower of the way of Jesus, that a follower of the way of Jesus could not be a follower of grand apartheid. And grand apartheid is alive, I won't call it well, in Israel today. And in our churches, my final note, in our churches, because of an ecumenical contract, whereby if Jewish friends do not throw at us our Christian anti-Semitism that contributed to the Holocaust, we will not declare the apartheid society that Israel has tragically become. And that pact of silence is a silence that has to be broken. And I would encourage us, as we look at oppression from the perspective of Palestinians, as we look at the gospel again from the perspective of faithfulness to Jesus Christ and his pursuance of justice as all determinative in our theologies, as we engage in these twin endeavors, we will be able to aspire to doing the things the international community and church came to do in assisting the Black struggle to throw off the yoke of apartheid. 3 of my Palestinian Christian friends wrote to the leaders of a great European Christian church last week. And you know what they said? They said, hey, we're here. We just want to say hello because we don't think you are aware we're here, but we're in Palestine and we'd like to talk to you because, they said it more politely, you're talking a lot of rubbish and your tongues need redemption. And until you talk to the oppressed, you'll sustain the rubbish.
Thank you very much, Brian, and to Alan as well for some very enlightening things there. Can I just encourage everybody else in the next minute or so, we're going to start our question and answer session. So if you have a question for either of our speakers, and I would certainly encourage you to ask them, please use that raise your hand function. For those of you that are watching this on catch up, this is the end of our 3rd session of Cry for Hope. We hope you've enjoyed the speakers, and we'll see you again hopefully next week.